The census pages that erased families to preserve order were not written in secret rooms or hidden vaults. They were printed, numbered, signed, and filed in full view of the state. This documentary examines how official population records presented as neutral instruments of governance became tools that quietly dissolved bloodlines, separated kin, and rewrote human existence into categories that served power rather than truth. In the 19th century United States, the census was described as a civic ritual. Every 10 years, enumerators moved across towns, plantations, ports, and frontier settlements, recording who lived where, who worked, who owned, and who belonged. On paper, it appeared orderly. Columns were ruled with ink, headings were clear, names, ages, sex, color, and condition were entered with measured handwriting. Yet within those pages, entire families vanished without violence, without protest, and without record of loss. For free white households, the census affirmed presence. Names were spelled carefully. Lineage was implied through proximity. Sons followed fathers, wives followed husbands. Property and occupation framed a life that the state recognized as coherent and continuous. But for enslaved people, free people of color, and those who existed between legal definitions, the census often recorded only numbers, initials, or classifications. In many years, enslaved individuals were not named at all. They were counted as tallies under an owner's household, listed by age and sex, stripped of personal identity, rendered interchangeable. This absence was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate administrative philosophy. The census was not designed to document humanity in full. It was designed to preserve order. Order meant stability of labor. Order meant clarity of ownership. Order meant preventing claims that might challenge the existing hierarchy. Naming an enslaved person's family relations would have implied continuity across generations. It would have suggested inheritance, memory, and moral obligation. The census avoided this by design. Enumerators were instructed to record enslaved populations separately, without surnames, without relationships, and without acknowledgement of kinship. A mother and her children could appear on the same page, yet no line connected them. A husband might be listed under one owner, his wife under another, their shared life dissolved by the structure of the form. On paper, they were not a family. They were inventory. Even among free people of color, erasure took subtler forms. Names were inconsistently spelled or replaced with generic labels. Racial classifications shifted from census to census, reflecting local prejudices rather than personal identity. A man recorded as mulatto in one decade might appear as black in the next, or vanish entirely if his presence complicated racial quotas or voting thresholds. Families that crossed color lines were especially vulnerable to disappearance. Their existence threatened the clarity that census categories were meant to enforce. Women were frequently absorbed into male identities. Married women, particularly those without property, were often recorded only as age ranges within a household. Their maiden names disappeared. Their previous families became untraceable. If a woman moved across county lines or state borders, her trail often ended entirely. For women of color, the loss was more complete. Their labor might be counted, but their personhood was not. The census also served economic power. In regions dependent on agriculture or extraction, population figures justified representation, taxation, and investment. Inflating numbers of laborers without acknowledging their families allowed states to claim productivity without confronting the moral cost. At the same time, undercounting free black populations minimized their political presence. Erasure was not always total. Sometimes it was selective, strategic, and precise. After emancipation, the census changed its language but not its habits. Formerly enslaved people were finally named, yet the damage was already done. Families seeking to reunite after decades of forced separation turned to census records hoping to trace lost relatives. What they found were gaps. Children listed without parents, adults appearing suddenly with no recorded past, entire communities emerging from blank space as if they had been born without history. Clerks and officials defended these records as products of their time. They claimed the forms allowed no room for complexity. They insisted they merely followed instructions. But those instructions were written by lawmakers who understood exactly what clarity required. Complexity invited questions. Questions invited claims. Claims threatened order. The census also shaped memory. Historians, genealogists, and courts relied on these documents as authoritative. What was not written was assumed not to exist. A family that could not be traced through census pages struggled to assert inheritance, residency, or even citizenship. Absence became evidence against them. Silence became proof. In some counties, entire black neighborhoods disappeared between decades. Not because they were destroyed, but because they were redrawn. Boundaries shifted. Enumeration districts changed. A community might be split across pages, its cohesion invisible to later readers. In other cases, officials deliberately ignored transient or marginal populations. Those who lived in rented rooms, labor camps, or informal settlements were easily overlooked. Their invisibility was convenient. The moral weight of this erasure lies not only in what was lost, but in how calmly it occurred. There were no riots over census forms, no public trials, no official apologies. The violence was administrative, executed with pen and paper, justified by efficiency. Families learned they did not exist in the eyes of the state, not through force, but through omission. For older Americans today, these records often represent the first place they look when seeking origins. The disappointment they encounter is not simply genealogical, it is existential. To realize that one's ancestors were counted but not named, recorded but not recognized, is to confront a history where order mattered more than truth. The census promised a mirror of the nation. Instead, it offered a selective portrait, one that preserved power by simplifying humanity. It did not need to lie. It only needed to leave things out. The pages remain. They sit in archives, digitized and indexed, their columns still clean, their handwriting still legible. What is missing is harder to see. It exists in the spaces between lines, in the unnamed relationships, in the families that lived, loved, worked, and endured without ever being allowed to appear together on the page. The horror is quiet. It does not announce itself. It waits in the assumption that records are neutral, that numbers are honest, and that silence means absence. The census did not merely count people. It decided who could be remembered, and in doing so, it shaped a nation's understanding of itself, leaving generations to search for names that were never allowed to be written. In the decades that followed, the authority of the census hardened rather than softened. As the nation expanded westward and absorbed new territories, the same instruments of enumeration were carried forward as symbols of modern governance. They were presented as evidence that the state could see everyone, know everyone, and therefore rule justly. Yet the same exclusions persisted, now embedded so deeply in administrative practice that they appeared natural. In rural counties, enumerators were often local men. They knew the households they visited, or believed they did. Their judgments shaped the record. A family that lived on the margins of respectability could be compressed into fewer lines. A woman living without a husband might be absorbed into a nearby household to avoid raising questions. A mixed-race family might be classified in a way that aligned with local custom rather than lived reality. The census did not correct prejudice. It standardized it. For indigenous communities, the erasure took another form. Many were excluded entirely, deemed outside the population that mattered for representation. Others were counted only when their presence affected land claims or federal oversight. Names were anglicized or replaced. Kinship systems that did not resemble European nuclear families were ignored. What survived on the page bore little resemblance to life as it was lived. What was lost could not be recovered through official means. The census also trained the public to accept absence as order. Newspapers reported totals, not stories. Legislators debated figures, not faces. Over time, citizens learned to trust the abstraction. If a group did not appear in sufficient numbers, it was assumed they were insignificant. If a family could not be traced, it was assumed they had no standing. The moral implications of this logic were rarely examined. By the early 20th century, new categories were added, refining the language of classification. Yet refinement did not bring restoration, it brought precision. Labels multiplied, but relationships remained secondary. The individual was still defined by how the state needed to see them, not by how they understood themselves. Families fragmented by earlier omissions found no relief in greater detail. The gap simply became more carefully measured. Some attempted to resist. Community leaders wrote letters correcting errors. Clergy submitted lists of congregants omitted or misclassified. Families petitioned for amendments. These efforts were rarely successful. Once the census was closed, it became fixed. Its authority depended on finality. To reopen it would have acknowledged fallibility, and fallibility threatened the aura of order. The consequences extended into law. Courts cited census data to determine residency, eligibility, and legitimacy. An absent name could invalidate a claim. A misrecorded age could alter inheritance. A racial classification could determine access to schools, neighborhoods, or employment. The census was no longer merely descriptive, it was dispositive. For those already marginalized, this meant living under a permanent presumption of uncertainty. Their histories existed in fragments, passed down orally, carried in memory rather than paper. When memory conflicted with record, memory lost. The state trusted its pages more than its people. The quiet cruelty of this system lay in its restraint. There were no chains in the enumeration process, no visible force. The harm was delayed, unfolding over generations as families attempted to locate themselves within a story that had excluded them from the beginning. The pain was often private, experienced in archives, libraries, and county offices, where descendants confronted the blankness left behind. Even today, researchers encounter these silences. They appear as sudden beginnings, as if a lineage emerged without origin. They appear as households that exist for one decade and then dissolve without explanation. They appear as names repeated without connection, suggesting relation but offering no proof. Each silence reflects a choice once made, a decision that order mattered more than completeness. To understand these pages is not to accuse every clerk or enumerator of malice. Many believe they were performing a neutral task, but neutrality itself was shaped by power. The forms they used, the categories they followed, and the omissions they accepted were products of a society invested in hierarchy. The census did not invent that hierarchy. It stabilized it. The enduring lesson is not simply that records can be flawed. It is that systems designed to simplify reality will always privilege what they already understand. What falls outside that understanding becomes invisible. Families whose structures, identities, or histories complicated the narrative were quietly removed, not by decree, but by design. The census promised to count everyone. In practice, it counted what it needed to count. The rest were left to memory, to silence, or to disappearance. And so the pages endure, authoritative and incomplete, inviting trust while withholding truth. They remind us that history is not only written by those in power, but formatted by them. What does not fit the form is lost. The question that remains is not whether these families existed. They did. The question is whether a society that preserved order through erasure can ever fully reckon with what it chose not to see. As the 20th century progressed, the census became increasingly entwined with ideas of legitimacy and belonging. Its authority was no longer questioned by most citizens. It was treated as a neutral ledger of truth, a backbone of democracy, a quiet proof that the nation understood itself. Yet the same structural silences persisted, now reinforced by habit rather than debate. When industrialization drew workers into cities, families were compressed into crowded dwellings, boarding houses, and subdivided tenements. Enumerators moved quickly, often under pressure to complete their rounds. In these conditions, precision gave way to convenience. Households were simplified. Non-relatives were absorbed into family units without distinction. Women working as domestic laborers were recorded as servants rather than residents, even when they lived in the home for years. Their own families disappeared from view. For Black Americans migrating north, the census offered the promise of recognition in new places. Instead, it often reproduced the same distortions. Southern-born families arrived with fractured documentation, already weakened by decades of omission. In northern cities, they encountered new forms of classification that obscured kinship in different ways. Lodgers, cousins, and extended family members were flattened into categories that erased their bonds. The record suggested instability where there was, in fact, resilience. Immigrant families experienced parallel erasures. Names were altered to fit English orthography. Ages were estimated. Relationships were guessed. In some cases, enumerators decided that a household appeared too complex and reduced it to a simpler narrative. Children sent ahead to work were recorded separately from parents who followed years later. On paper, families appeared divided by choice rather than by economic necessity. The census also became a tool for moral judgment. Categories related to marital status, legitimacy, and dependency carried social weight. A woman listed as widowed might receive sympathy. A woman listed as single with children invited scrutiny. Enumerators sometimes adjusted these labels to align with local sensibilities, preserving reputations at the cost of accuracy. In doing so, they altered family histories permanently. Silence, once again, was the mechanism. No annotation marked these choices. No explanation accompanied the alterations. The page presented itself as fact. Later generations, encountering these records, interpreted them as truth rather than as decisions made under pressure, bias, or convenience. During periods of political anxiety, the census took on an even sharper edge. Population figures were used to justify restrictions, surveillance, and exclusion. Communities already underrepresented found themselves further diminished by undercounting. Families living in informal housing, labor camps, or segregated districts were missed or deliberately excluded. Their absence reinforced narratives of marginality. The harm was cumulative. Each decade built upon the previous one. A family omitted once was harder to find again. A misclassification hardened into lineage. Over time, the gaps grew wider, not because families ceased to exist, but because the record lost the ability to recognize them. For many descendants, the search for ancestry becomes an encounter with this architecture of loss. They move from one census to the next, following a name that shifts, disappears, or reappears altered. They encounter households that feel incomplete, stories that do not align. The frustration is not merely academic. It is a confrontation with a system that decided repeatedly that certain truths were unnecessary. What makes this history unsettling is its banality. There was no single decree ordering families to be erased. There was no dramatic moment of destruction. Instead, there was a steady accumulation of small decisions, each justified by efficiency, clarity, or order. Together, they produced a record that looks complete while remaining fundamentally incomplete. The census taught the nation how to see itself. It taught citizens to accept numbers over narratives, categories over connections. It normalized the idea that some lives could be summarized, others reduced, and still others omitted entirely without consequence. Over time, this lesson extended beyond the page. It shaped policy, perception, and memory. Even efforts at reform struggled against this legacy. Later censuses introduced new questions, more categories, greater sensitivity to diversity. Yet they inherited a foundation already marked by absence. They could record the present more carefully, but they could not restore what had been removed from the past. The silence remained. The moral weight of this silence does not lie only in historical injustice, it lies in the continuing reliance on these records as definitive. When institutions treat incomplete documents as complete, they perpetuate the original harm. They allow order to masquerade as truth. To read these census pages closely is to feel the tension between what is present and what is missing. The ink is confident, the lines are straight, yet behind them are lives lived in full complexity, reduced to fragments or erased altogether. The pages do not scream, they do not accuse, they simply fail to remember. And that failure, repeated over generations, becomes a form of quiet violence. It does not wound the body, it wounds continuity. It denies families the ability to see themselves reflected in the nation's mirror. The census was meant to answer a simple question: who is here? In answering it selectively, it answered another question instead: who matters? That answer was never spoken aloud. It did not need to be. It was written in absence, preserved in columns, and carried forward as administrative fact. The story of these erased families is not finished. It lingers in archives, in unanswered questions, in the uneasy recognition that what is missing was once deliberately ignored. To confront it is not to reject the record, but to read it with awareness, understanding that order has always come at a cost. As the century moved closer to its midpoint, the census had become something more than a record. It had become a quiet arbiter of legitimacy. Federal programs, housing policies, school funding, and political representation all leaned on its figures. What had once been an abstract exercise in counting now carried tangible consequences. Families that did not appear clearly within its pages found themselves struggling to prove they belonged anywhere at all. During periods of economic crisis, these consequences sharpened. Relief programs relied on census data to define need. Neighborhoods undercounted decades earlier appeared smaller, less urgent, less deserving. Assistance bypassed them not out of malice, but because the numbers suggested absence. Families learned that erasure did not end with the page. It followed them into policy, opportunity, and survival. The language of the census continued to imply neutrality. Officials spoke of accuracy, efficiency, and national interest. Yet neutrality assumed a shared starting point, and the nation did not possess one. Communities whose histories had already been thinned by slavery, displacement, and exclusion were asked to trust a system that had never fully acknowledged them. Each new count promised improvement. Each relied on foundations already compromised. Within families, the effects were subtle but enduring. Stories passed down orally began to conflict with written records. A grandmother insisted on siblings who never appeared on paper. An uncle was said to have lived in a household where the census showed no trace. Over time, memory itself came under suspicion. Descendants learned to doubt their elders, to privilege documents over lived testimony. The state's version of the past replaced the family's. This quiet displacement of memory altered identity. To know who one is often requires knowing who came before. When that knowledge is fragmented, identity becomes provisional. Families adapt by simplifying their own narratives, trimming away uncertainty. In doing so, they mirror the very process that erased them. Complexity yields to order once again. The census also shaped how communities were perceived by others. Researchers, journalists, and officials used its data to describe social conditions. Maps were drawn, trends were identified, areas with sparse data were labeled unstable or transient. These labels justified further neglect. Erasure became self-reinforcing. What makes this process difficult to confront is its distance from overt cruelty. There is no villain easily named, No single moment of decision to condemn. The harm is distributed across time, across offices, across routines. Responsibility dissolves into procedure. Yet the outcome remains unmistakable. In the archives, the silence persists. Boxes of schedules sit intact, their contents preserved. Marginal notes reveal corrections to spelling, adjustments to age, occasional acknowledgement of error. Rarely do they acknowledge what cannot be corrected. There is no notation for a family that should have been there but was not. No column for relationships that did not fit the form. The census did not ask certain questions because asking them would have required uncomfortable answers. It did not record enslaved marriages because the law did not recognize them. It did not track extended kinship because it complicated inheritance and property. It did not preserve informal households because they challenged the idealized structure the state preferred to see. Silence was easier. For older viewers today, raised to respect institutions and records, this realization carries weight. It asks for a different kind of reading, one that listens for absence as carefully as presence. It requires acknowledging that official history is not merely incomplete by accident, but shaped by values that prioritized order over dignity. The endurance of these census pages forces a question that remains unresolved. Can a nation built on selective memory fully understand itself? Can reconciliation occur when foundational records omit the very relationships that define humanity? There is no simple answer offered by the documents themselves. They remain fixed, authoritative, resistant to reinterpretation. The work of restoration falls instead to those willing to read between lines, to cross-reference silences, to trust memory alongside paper. It is slow work, often frustrating and never complete. Yet even this effort cannot undo what was lost in the moment of recording. A name never written cannot be recovered with certainty. A family never acknowledged cannot be fully reconstructed. The census froze these absences in time, giving them permanence. The true legacy of these pages is not merely historical distortion. It is the normalization of forgetting, a lesson taught quietly, repeated every decade, that what is not recorded does not matter. That lesson shaped governance, scholarship, and self-understanding alike. To sit with these records is to sit with restraint. The horror they contain is not dramatic, it is administrative. It is the calm decision to move on, to leave a line blank, to accept a number where a name might have been. It is the choice to preserve order even when order demands erasure. The families who disappeared from these pages did not disappear from life. They lived, worked, loved, argued, endured. Their absence is not evidence of insignificance. It is evidence of a system that could not afford to see them fully. And so the pages remain, clean and silent, offering answers to the questions they were designed to ask, and refusing all others. As these records age, their authority only deepens. Time grants them a gravity that discourages doubt. The paper yellows, the ink fades, and yet the assumption persists that what survived must be true. What did not survive is treated as unknowable and therefore irrelevant. This is how absence hardens into accepted history. For many institutions, the census became a substitute for understanding. Universities built studies upon its figures. Governments justified boundaries and policies through its totals. Even moral arguments were shaped by its abstractions. When a population appeared small on paper, its suffering was easier to overlook. When a family line could not be traced, its claims were easier to deny. The danger of this reliance lies in the illusion of completeness. The census appears exhaustive. It presents itself as having looked everywhere, having asked everyone. In reality, it looked where it was told to look, and it asked questions it was prepared to answer. What lay outside those limits remained unseen. The emotional toll of this erasure often surfaced late, when descendants sought certainty rather than survival. A retired worker, finally free to ask where his grandparents came from, encounters a gap. A woman tracing her mother's line finds only numbers where names should be. The realization arrives quietly, often alone in a reading room, that the state did not consider her family worth remembering properly. This moment carries a particular weight for older generations. Raised to trust records, to respect authority, they confront the possibility that the most official documents may have failed them. The betrayal is subtle. It is not dramatic. It is the slow recognition that the system they believed in was never designed to see everyone equally. Some respond by turning away from the record entirely, retreating into oral history and private memory. Others continue to search, assembling fragments from church registers, land deeds, and family Bibles. These efforts reveal a parallel archive, one built from persistence rather than permission. Yet even this archive remains incomplete, shadowed by what was never written down. The census does not acknowledge this parallel history. It does not mark its own limits. It offers no warning that its silence is meaningful. This refusal to signal absence is perhaps its most enduring flaw. It teaches readers to accept the page as the full story. In this way, the census shaped not only policy but imagination. It trained generations to think of society as a set of discrete, legible units. Families that did not conform to this vision were treated as anomalies rather than as evidence of a broader human reality. Complexity was framed as disorder. Order was framed as virtue. The moral discomfort arises when one recognizes that this framing was not neutral. It reflected choices about whose lives deserved clarity and whose could remain blurred. Those choices aligned consistently with power. They favored property holders, legal marriages, recognized lineages. They disfavored those whose lives challenged neat classification. The absence of overt cruelty makes this history easy to ignore. There are no scenes of violence to confront, no villains to condemn outright. The harm is procedural, embedded in forms and instructions. It operates through compliance rather than coercion. And because it appears reasonable, it endures. To sit with this history is to accept discomfort without resolution. There is no moment of correction that restores what was lost. The census cannot be rewritten retroactively. The families it failed to record remain partially obscured, their outlines visible only through effort and inference. What remains is a question of responsibility, not for the clerks of the past, many long gone, but for the readers of the present. To treat these records as complete is to continue the erasure. To read them critically is to acknowledge their power and their limits. This does not mean rejecting the census entirely. It means understanding it as a product of its values. It means recognizing that order was often achieved by simplifying humanity, and that simplification carried moral cost. It means holding space for what is missing. The census promised to make the nation visible to itself. In doing so, it decided what visibility meant. Families that fit the vision were illuminated. Those that did not were left in shadow. The shadows remain, stretching across generations, shaping identity, memory, and belonging. There is no final reckoning contained in these pages, only an invitation to look more carefully, to question what appears settled, and to listen for the silence beneath the ink. That silence beneath the ink is not empty. It is dense with implication. It carries the weight of decisions made quietly, repeatedly, and without reflection. To recognize it is to understand that the census did not simply observe society. It participated in shaping it. For much of its history, the census operated on an assumption rarely stated aloud, that stability required legibility. People had to be placed into categories that could be managed, predicted, and governed. Families that complicated those categories were inconvenient. Their complexity threatened administrative calm. The solution was not confrontation, but omission. This approach influenced how people learned to describe themselves. Over time, individuals adapted their identities to fit what the state could recognize. Relationships were simplified when speaking to officials. Ages were rounded. Kinship was narrowed to what could be explained quickly. In this way, the census shaped behavior, encouraging conformity to its expectations. The cost of this adaptation was often internal. Families learned to compress their own histories, to present themselves in ways that felt safer, more acceptable. Stories that did not align with official categories were shared less often, eventually fading. Silence moved from the page into the household. This migration of silence is perhaps the most lasting harm. When families stop telling their own stories because they do not appear to matter publicly, erasure becomes self-sustaining. The census no longer needs to omit them. They omit themselves. Yet traces remain, in inconsistencies, in sudden changes of address, in unexplained absences between decades. For those trained to see them, these irregularities speak quietly of lives lived outside the form. They suggest resilience rather than disappearance. Still, recognition of these traces requires effort and patience. It requires resisting the temptation to accept the record at face value. For many, that resistance feels uncomfortable. It challenges trust in institutions that promise fairness and order. It asks older generations in particular to reconsider assumptions formed over a lifetime. The discomfort is not accidental. It reflects the moral tension at the heart of bureaucratic power. Systems designed to manage populations must simplify. In simplifying, they inevitably distort. The question is not whether distortion occurs, but whose lives bear its weight. In the case of the census, the answer has been consistent. Those already marginalized carried the burden. Their families were thinned, fragmented, or erased to maintain a picture of society that favored clarity over truth. There is a temptation to view this as a closed chapter, a flaw of earlier eras corrected by modern sensibilities. But the legacy of these pages persists. Contemporary debates over representation, resources, and recognition still rest on foundations laid by earlier counts. The absences of the past continue to shape the present. Understanding this history does not offer comfort, it offers responsibility. To read the census today is to engage with a document that demands interpretation, not reverence. It requires acknowledging that what appears orderly may conceal harm, and that silence can be as consequential as speech. The families erased to preserve order did not consent to their disappearance. They did not agree to be simplified, renamed, or omitted. Their erasure was the byproduct of a system that valued manageability over humanity. That system did not announce its priorities, it enacted them quietly. The moral horror of this history lies in its restraint. There were no cries recorded, no protests preserved in the margins, only lines drawn, boxes filled, and boxes left empty. The damage unfolded slowly, over decades, embedded in routines that appeared harmless. To confront this past honestly is to accept that order, when pursued without regard for dignity, can become a form of cruelty. It is to recognize that some of the nation's most trusted records carry within them a record of what was denied. The census asked who was present. It rarely asked who was missing. That second question remains unanswered, echoing across generations, waiting for readers willing to hear it. The unanswered question of who was missing lingers because it was never meant to be asked. The census was constructed to reassure, not to interrogate itself. Its authority depended on the appearance of completion. To admit uncertainty would have undermined the very order it was designed to protect. Over time, this confidence seeped into national identity. Americans learned to believe that their country could be measured, mapped, and understood through its records. That belief carried comfort. It suggested control. It implied fairness. Few were encouraged to consider who paid the price for that sense of order. For families erased or fragmented by enumeration, the price was paid quietly. There was no single moment of realization. Instead, there were small encounters with absence. A missing name in a ledger. A question from a child that could not be answered. A family story that stopped abruptly, not because it ended, but because the trail went cold. These moments accumulated. They shaped how people understood their place in history. Some learned to see themselves as peripheral, their roots shallow or uncertain. Others developed a persistent sense that something essential had been taken, though they could not name precisely what it was. The harm was psychological, as much as historical. The census did not intend to produce this harm, but intention does not erase impact. Systems exert power regardless of motive. When that power is exercised, repeatedly, across generations, its effects become structural. The erasure of families became woven into the fabric of governance, education, and memory. Even when later efforts sought inclusion, they operated within the same framework. New questions were added, but old assumptions remained. The form still privileged certain definitions of family, stability, and belonging. Those who fit easily were counted clearly. Those who did not were adjusted, compressed, or overlooked. This persistence reveals a deeper truth. Bureaucratic systems resist moral reflection. They value consistency over conscience. Once established, they perpetuate themselves, refining technique rather than purpose. The census became better at counting, but not necessarily better at seeing. To recognize this is not to abandon record-keeping, but to approach it with humility. It is to understand that documents are not neutral mirrors, but instruments shaped by human priorities. They reflect what a society chooses to value and what it is willing to ignore. For the families erased to preserve order, recognition may never come in official form. Their names may never be restored to the pages that excluded them. Their relationships may never be formally acknowledged. What remains is the possibility of awareness, of reading the record with an understanding of its limits. This awareness does not resolve the past. It does not fill every gap. It offers no clean closure. Instead, it invites a quieter reckoning, one that accepts ambiguity, honors memory, and resists the comfort of false completeness. The census pages remain unchanged. They do not apologize. They do not explain themselves. They simply endure, authoritative and incomplete, asking to be trusted. The responsibility lies with the reader to decide how that trust is given. To look at these pages honestly is to see both what they show and what they conceal. It is to recognize that order, when elevated above humanity, leaves scars that do not fade easily. It is to accept that some histories survive only in silence, carried forward not by ink, but by those who refuse to forget. That refusal to forget is often quiet and solitary. It takes place far from public ceremonies or official acknowledgments. It happens in private research, in careful listening, in the decision to treat gaps as meaningful rather than empty. For many, especially those in later life, this work becomes a reckoning not only with history, but with trust itself. Trust in records, trust in institutions, trust in the idea that the nation told the truth about who belonged. When that trust erodes, it does not collapse suddenly. It thins. It becomes cautious. People learn to read official documents with a kind of guarded attention, aware that authority and accuracy are not the same. This awareness is unsettling, particularly for generations taught that order and fairness were synonymous. The census never claimed to tell every story, yet it benefited from the assumption that it did. Its authority rested on the belief that what mattered would appear on the page. By shaping that belief, it shaped the boundaries of concern. Lives outside the record became easier to dismiss, not through hostility but through neglect. This is how bureaucratic harm often functions. It does not require hatred. It requires indifference, routine, and the steady prioritization of efficiency over empathy. The census exemplified this dynamic. Its omissions were rarely questioned because they were familiar. Familiarity breeds acceptance. The endurance of this acceptance is evident in how these records are still used. They are cited in family histories, legal arguments, and academic studies with an assumption of reliability. Footnotes reference them as foundations. Rarely is their silence interrogated with the same rigor as their data. To interrogate that silence is uncomfortable. It demands slowing down, resisting neat conclusions, and accepting that some questions will remain unresolved. It asks for a form of moral patience that modern systems rarely reward, yet this patience is necessary. Without it, the erasure continues. Each uncritical citation, each unquestioned assumption, reinforces the authority of a record that was never complete. The harm becomes self-perpetuating, carried forward by good faith rather than malice. The families erased to preserve order occupy a difficult place in history. They are neither fully visible nor entirely lost. They exist in fragments, in contradictions, in the spaces where the record falters. To acknowledge them requires accepting uncertainty as part of truth. This acceptance does not diminish history. It deepens it. It allows for a more honest engagement with the past, one that recognizes power not only in what is recorded, but in what is omitted. It challenges the idea that order is inherently virtuous, revealing the costs hidden beneath its calm surface. The census will always be a central artifact of national memory. It cannot be undone, and it cannot be replaced. But it can be read differently, not as a final word, but as a negotiated one, not as a complete map, but as a partial guide marked by deliberate silences. Those silences do not accuse, they do not demand attention, they simply wait, waiting for readers willing to pause, to question, and to listen for what the page cannot say. In that listening, something shifts. The record loses its false certainty. The past becomes less orderly, but more human. Families once reduced to numbers regain a measure of presence, not through official restoration, but through recognition. This recognition does not close the story. It opens it, carefully and without resolution, acknowledging that some truths remain just beyond reach. The census preserved order. It did so at a cost that can still be felt, quietly, wherever a line ends too soon, or a name never appears. That cost remains difficult to measure because it does not appear in totals or charts. It appears instead in hesitation, in uncertainty, in the subtle sense of dislocation that accompanies an incomplete past. For many families, especially those long denied stable recognition, history feels provisional, subject to correction by a record that never fully included them. This provisional quality alters how people relate to time. The past feels fragile, easily interrupted. The future feels uncertain, built on foundations that may not hold. The census, intended to stabilize society, inadvertently contributed to this instability by denying continuity to those it failed to see. What is striking is how rarely this dynamic enters public conversation. Discussions of census accuracy focus on numbers missed or miscounted, not on relationships erased. The loss of a family connection does not register as an error in the same way a numerical discrepancy does, yet its impact is often deeper and more enduring. The record treats individuals as units. Families, however, are not simply aggregates of individuals. They are networks of memory, obligation, and meaning. By refusing to fully acknowledge these networks, the census reduced people to isolated points. In doing so, it stripped away context that gives life coherence. This reduction was especially consequential in moments of transition, after migration, after emancipation, after displacement. At precisely the times when continuity mattered most, the record was least capable of preserving it. Families emerging from upheaval found no stable reflection of themselves in the documents meant to define the nation. The calm tone of these records masks their role in this process. There is no trace of doubt in the handwriting, no sign of the lives compressed or omitted. The page remains serene, confident, complete in its own terms. That serenity is part of its power. It discourages challenge. To read against that serenity requires intention. It requires understanding that absence is not neutral. It requires recognizing that silence can be engineered, maintained, and defended without ever being declared. The census did not need to argue for erasure. It simply practiced it. For those willing to engage this history, the work is less about recovery than about acknowledgement. Some gaps will never be filled. Some names will never be found. The task is not to resolve every absence, but to resist treating absence as insignificance. In this resistance there is a quiet form of justice. Not the justice of correction or restoration, but the justice of recognition. It affirms that what was omitted still mattered, even if the record could not accommodate it. The census remains what it has always been, a tool shaped by the values of its time. It reflects a belief that order can be achieved through simplification, and that simplification is harmless. The history of erased families reveals the flaw in that belief. Order achieved at the expense of truth does not disappear. It lingers, shaping perception long after the original decision-makers are gone. It becomes tradition. It becomes common sense. And in that form, it is hardest to challenge. The pages endure, silent and authoritative. They do not invite reinterpretation. They wait for it. They offer a choice to each reader, to accept their completeness or to question it. That choice determines whether the erasure remains intact, or whether it is at least named. The census remains what it has always been, a tool shaped by the values of its time. It reflects a belief that order can be achieved through simplification, and that simplification is harmless. The history of erased families reveals the flaw in that belief. Order achieved at the expense of truth does not disappear. It lingers, shaping perception long after the original decision-makers are gone. It becomes tradition. It becomes common sense. And in that form, it is hardest to challenge. The pages endure, silent and authoritative. They do not invite reinterpretation. They wait for it. They offer a choice to each reader to accept their completeness or to question it. That choice determines whether the erasure remains intact, or whether it is at least named. Naming the erasure does not restore what was taken, but it alters how the past is held. It shifts the weight of authority away from the page alone, and places it also on judgment, context, and moral awareness. This shift is quiet. It does not announce itself. It happens gradually, as readers learn to sit with uncertainty rather than rush to closure. For older generations, this can be a difficult adjustment. Many were taught that history properly recorded was stable and knowable. To accept that foundational, documents were shaped by exclusion challenges deeply held beliefs about fairness and progress. It introduces doubt where certainty once lived. Yet this doubt is not corrosive. It is clarifying. It allows for a more honest engagement with the past, one that recognizes that systems of order often operate at the expense of those least able to resist them. It reframes the census not as a neutral witness, but as an active participant in shaping social reality. The families erased to preserve order did not vanish from history entirely. They persist in traces, in mismatches, in stories that refuse to align neatly with the record. These fragments demand a different kind of attention, one that values listening as much as documentation. In this listening, the census loses some of its dominance. It becomes one source among many, rather than the final arbiter of existence. Memory, oral history, and lived experience regain legitimacy. The past becomes less tidy, but more truthful. This truth is uncomfortable precisely because it resists resolution. There is no moment when the damage is undone, no official acknowledgement that satisfies the loss. The erasure remains a fact, embedded in the nation's administrative DNA. What changes is how that fact is understood. Understanding does not bring comfort. It brings responsibility. To carry forward the awareness that order has costs, and that those costs were unevenly distributed. To recognize that silence, when institutionalized, becomes a form of power. The census pages will continue to be consulted, cited, and trusted. They will remain indispensable, but they need not be unquestioned. Their authority can coexist with critique. Their usefulness need not obscure their limitations. The families missing from these records remind us that history is not only what is written, but also what is withheld. That withholding was not random. It served a purpose. It preserved a vision of society that valued manageability over moral completeness. To see that clearly is to accept that the past is neither wholly knowable nor entirely lost. It is partial, shaped, and contested. The census offers one version of it, calm and ordered. Beneath that order lies a quieter story, one of lives lived beyond the margins of the page. That story does not end. It waits, carried forward by those who notice the gaps and refuse to treat them as empty. It survives in the recognition that absence itself can speak if one is willing to listen. That willingness to listen changes the relationship between the present and the past. It introduces a form of attentiveness that official history rarely encourages. Instead of asking only what is documented, it asks why certain things were never documented at all. It treats omission not as failure alone, but as evidence of intention. The census was shaped by what those in power believed needed to be known. Everything else was secondary. Families whose existence complicated economic systems, racial hierarchies, or moral narratives were inconvenient to record fully. Their partial visibility was sufficient for governance. Their full humanity was not required. This logic was rarely articulated. It did not need to be. It was embedded in forms, instructions, and categories. Over time, it became invisible, accepted as the natural order of things. The census did not argue for exclusion. It normalized it. Normalization is powerful. Once a practice becomes routine, it ceases to attract scrutiny. Clerks filled in boxes as they had been taught. Enumerators followed guidelines passed down without question. Readers trusted the result. Each step reinforced the next. The erasure became systemic, not personal. For those affected, the system's impersonality offered no relief. Harm delivered without malice is still harm. Families denied recognition did not experience it as abstraction. They experienced it as confusion, loss, and a persistent sense that something essential had been withheld. This sense often surfaced later in life, when urgency faded and reflection began. It emerged when people had time to look backward rather than forward. In these moments, the gaps in the record took on new meaning. They were no longer inconveniences. They were absences demanding explanation. What makes these absences especially heavy is that they cannot be appealed. There is no authority empowered to restore what was never acknowledged. The census does not revisit its own silences. It does not revise its past. It moves forward, leaving earlier omissions intact. The finality of this process is part of its cruelty. Once recorded, the absence becomes permanent. It outlives the people who caused it. It shapes narratives long after the context that produced it has faded. The record remains authoritative and unyielding. This permanence stands in contrast to the fragility of memory. Oral histories can be forgotten. Stories can change. Yet the written record, however incomplete, endures. It asserts itself as the more reliable source, even when it is a source of erasure. To challenge this imbalance requires effort and humility. It means accepting that official documents do not possess moral neutrality. They reflect priorities, fears, and compromises. They tell us as much about what a society chose to ignore as about what it chose to see. The census, in preserving order, preserved a particular vision of the nation. It favored stability over truth, clarity over complexity. That vision offered reassurance to some while denying recognition to others. The cost of that reassurance was borne quietly, across generations. There is no dramatic reckoning awaiting these pages, no moment when they are exposed and overturned. Their influence is too deeply woven into the fabric of governance and memory. What remains possible is a change in how they are read. Reading with awareness does not erase the harm, but it prevents its repetition in thought. It allows the present to acknowledge the limits of its inheritance. It creates space for stories that were never meant to survive on paper. The families erased to preserve order are not asking for restoration from the page. They are beyond that reach. What remains is the responsibility of the living to recognize that order was achieved through omission, and that omission carries moral weight. The census did what it was designed to do. It counted, it classified, it simplified. In doing so, it revealed the values of the system that produced it. Those values are still worth examining. Those values become clearest when one considers what the census could have done, but chose not to do. It could have asked about relationships beyond legal marriage. It could have recorded kinship as people understood it, rather than as the law defined it. It could have preserved names even when status was denied. None of this was impossible. It was simply undesirable within the framework of order. Order required predictability. Predictability required simplification. And simplification required sacrifice. That sacrifice was not evenly distributed. It fell along familiar lines of power. Those whose lives aligned with legal, economic, and moral norms were recorded with clarity. Those whose lives existed under constraint, coercion, or informal arrangement were reduced or erased. The census did not invent inequality, but it gave inequality a durable administrative form. This durability is what distinguishes bureaucratic harm from other kinds. Violence wounds and heals or kills. Erasure lingers. It shapes what can be known, claimed, and remembered. It reaches forward in time, affecting people who never encountered the original act. In this sense, the census functioned as a quiet inheritance. It passed forward not wealth or property, but absence. Descendants inherited gaps they did not create, silences they did not choose. They were left to navigate a past that resisted coherence. The restraint of this harm makes it easy to overlook. There are no dramatic images to confront, no singular events to memorialize. Instead, there is paper, columns, totals, the calm surface of administration. That calm is deceptive. It conceals the moral trade-offs beneath. To dwell on this history is not to assign blame to individuals long gone. It is to examine a system that prioritized order above relational truth. It is to recognize that the desire for neatness can carry ethical consequences when applied to human lives. For many older viewers, this recognition may arrive alongside a broader reckoning with institutions once trusted implicitly. The census becomes one example among many, illustrating how authority can operate without cruelty of intent, yet still produce harm. This realization does not demand rejection of the past, but a more careful relationship with it. Care in this context means attention. It means reading slowly, noticing what is missing, resisting the impulse to fill gaps with assumption, accepting that some histories remain unresolved, not because they are insignificant, but because they were deliberately simplified out of existence. The census pages will continue to be preserved, cited, and displayed. They will remain central to the nation's understanding of itself. Their authority will not disappear. What can change is the posture of those who encounter them. To approach these records with humility is to acknowledge that order is not the same as truth, that legibility is not the same as justice, that silence, when repeated and institutionalized, becomes a form of power. The families erased to preserve order are not visible in the way history often demands. They do not appear as heroes or victims in the traditional sense. They appear as absences, as discontinuities, as questions that refuse to settle. Those questions remain. They do not accuse. They do not ask for resolution. They simply persist, reminding us that what is most damaging is not always what is done openly, but what is quietly left undone. What was quietly left undone continues to shape how the nation understands itself. The census, for all its authority, offers a lesson in restraint. Not the restraint of mercy, but the restraint of omission. It shows how power can act most effectively when it limits what is seen, rather than forcing what must be believed. The act of counting appears neutral, even benevolent, yet every count implies a decision about what qualifies as countable. In the case of families, the census narrowed that qualification to forms of relationship it could easily manage. Anything beyond that boundary became administratively inconvenient. Inconvenience over time hardened into invisibility. This invisibility was not random. It aligned with structures of labor, property, and control. Families disrupted by enslavement, migration, poverty, or informal bonds were least likely to be fully recorded. Their instability, often imposed rather than chosen, made them difficult to classify. Rather than adapt the record to reality, the record adapted reality to itself. That adaptation had consequences beyond memory. It influenced how legitimacy was defined. A family visible in the census appeared stable, rooted, entitled. A family absent or fragmented appeared transient, suspect, or marginal. These impressions fed into policy decisions, social attitudes, and institutional trust. The census did not merely reflect society's hierarchies, it reinforced them. By repeatedly presenting a simplified vision of the population, it taught citizens what normal looked like. Anything outside that vision became abnormal by default. Over generations, this lesson shaped expectations, judgments, and even aspirations. The moral weight of this process lies in its quietness. There was no need for enforcement when the record itself defined reality. Once a family was omitted or simplified, the omission became part of the official story. That story was rarely challenged, because it appeared orderly and complete. For those seeking answers late in life, this realization can be disorienting. The past they were promised, one that could be traced and understood through records, proves elusive. What remains is a partial map, accurate in places, blank in others, with no legend explaining why. This disorientation is not a failure of curiosity. It is the result of a system that equated order with truth. The census offered reassurance that the nation could know itself fully. In doing so, it concealed the fact that some knowledge had been deliberately set aside. To acknowledge this is not to diminish the importance of the census. It is to place it in context, to see it as one voice among many, shaped by its time and priorities, to recognize that its silences are not accidents, but artifacts. The families erased to preserve order remain present in the consequences of that erasure, in the uncertainty passed down, in the stories that end abruptly, in the sense of incompleteness that accompanies an inherited past. These are not failures of memory. They are traces of a system that chose manageability over fullness. The pages themselves do not change. They remain fixed, calm, authoritative. They do not respond to questioning. They do not acknowledge loss. They simply endure, carrying forward both what they contain and what they omit. What changes slowly is the reader. The willingness to sit with absence, to resist the comfort of tidy conclusions, to accept that history, when filtered through systems of power, will always require careful listening for what is not said. The census counted a nation. In doing so, it decided how that nation would be seen, remembered, and understood. The cost of that decision is still being reckoned with, not through correction, but through awareness. That awareness grows slowly, often arriving without ceremony. It emerges when familiar assumptions begin to feel inadequate, when the record's confidence no longer satisfies the questions it provokes. The census, once trusted as a foundation, becomes a site of inquiry rather than reassurance. In this shift, the meaning of order itself is reconsidered. Order had promised fairness through uniformity, yet uniformity required ignoring difference, complexity, and contradiction. Families that did not conform were treated as problems to be managed rather than realities to be understood. The census resolved this tension by reducing what it could not accommodate. This reduction did not only affect those omitted, it shaped the consciousness of those included as well. By presenting a simplified portrait of society, it encouraged a simplified understanding of belonging. Citizens learned to see themselves through the categories provided, measuring legitimacy by visibility within the record. Those clearly named felt anchored. Those blurred or absent felt provisional. The long reach of this influence is difficult to overstate. It shaped how communities understood stability, how institutions defined normalcy, and how individuals assessed their own histories.
The census did not dictate these interpretations explicitly. It allowed them to emerge naturally from what it chose to show.
Silence, in this context, functioned as guidance.
It suggested that certain details were unnecessary, that some relationships did not merit preservation. Over time, the suggestion became assumption.
The absence of a record was interpreted as absence of significance. For families erased to preserve order, this assumption compounded loss. Not only were they omitted, but their omission was treated as confirmation that nothing had been lost. The harm was sealed by indifference. Yet indifference is not immutable. It can be interrupted by attention, by the decision to read differently, by the recognition that what appears settled may be incomplete. This interruption does not rewrite history, but it reframes it. To reframe is to accept that some questions will remain unanswered, that some gaps resist closure. This acceptance runs counter to the promise of records, which suggests that everything can be known if one looks carefully enough. The census reveals the limits of that promise. Those limits do not negate the value of the record. They contextualize it. They remind us that documents reflect priorities, not totalities. They capture what was deemed necessary, not everything that mattered. The families who disappear between lines and decades remain part of the nation's story, even if the record could not hold them. Their absence challenges the comfort of order, insisting that completeness is not the same as truth. The census endures as a monument to administrative certainty. Its pages are steady, untroubled by doubt. The work of reckoning belongs to those who read them now, aware that silence, too, is a form of record. The final reckoning offered by these pages is not dramatic. It does not arrive with revelation or correction. It arrives quietly, in the understanding that order was preserved by deciding what could be ignored. The census did not fail by accident. It succeeded according to its purpose. It delivered clarity to those who governed, stability to those who benefited, and reassurance to those who trusted it. What it did not deliver was wholeness. That absence was not a flaw in the system. It was the cost of the system. For the families erased to preserve order, there is no formal restoration waiting in the archives, no amendment that reunites names across decades, no footnote that acknowledges relationships once deemed inconvenient. Their history remains partial not because it lacked substance, but because it exceeded what the record was willing to hold. What remains instead is recognition. The recognition that silence can be intentional, that calm documents can carry moral weight, that a nation's most trusted records may tell the truth they were designed to tell, while withholding others just as deliberately. This recognition does not resolve the past. It leaves it unsettled, incomplete, and resistant to tidy conclusions. It asks the reader to sit with that discomfort rather than escape it, to accept that some histories survive only as shadows cast by omission. The census still stands as an artifact of governance. It will continue to be consulted, cited, and relied upon. Its authority will remain intact, but its silence need not go unnoticed. To notice is not to accuse, it is to understand. To understand that order, when elevated above dignity, produces losses that cannot be measured in numbers, that what is preserved on the page is only part of what mattered. The families who vanish from these records were never absent from life. They were present in work, in love, in endurance. Their erasure was administrative, not existential. It lives on only insofar as it is accepted without question. The final truth offered here is a quiet one. History is not only written by those in power, it is formatted by them. And what does not fit the format is left behind. The census preserved order. What it could not preserve was the full truth of the people it counted.